Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Studium Generale lecture. Wonderful to see you all here in this room. Thank you for coming. My name is Jaap Jansen. I'm program maker at Studium Generale. And I'm joined tonight by Professor Annemarie Mol. And also a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for coming to Maastricht as well. And Mrs. Mol was supposed to give this lecture in February, but due to illness she couldn't make it then, so I'm really happy that you were so willing to come back to give the lecture. Mrs. Annemarie Mol is a professor of anthropology of the body at the University of Amsterdam. She's an anthropologist, but she's also a philosopher, and maybe also a sociologist, a little bit. Whatever, you are a mixture of everything. And in her work, she combines ethnography, philosophy, sociology, with the challenge of shifting our theoretical discourses. So I hope that she will do that tonight as well. And she will give a lecture about a book which was published in 2021 with the fabulous and simple title, Eating in Theory. And in this book, Annemarie Mol asks how a closer look on eating can change our ways of understanding what it means to be human. As we taste, chew, digest, swallow, and excrete at the end, our food changes ourselves and our environment. And by doing fieldwork at food conferences, at research labs, at restaurants, and even her own kitchen table, Mrs. Mol started to rethink the central concepts of our philosophical tradition, such as being, doing, relating, and knowing. The lecture will take an hour, maybe 45 minutes, we don't know exactly. And after the lecture, Mrs. Mol will be pleased to take your questions. So please ask your questions after the lecture. And we will try to end this session at 9:30 at the latest. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the lecture. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good. Well, there we are. After dinner, I hope, for most of us. But we'll not talk about dinner, we'll talk about eating in theory. And the work that I present you is not just coming from my own work, it comes from at least the people you see here. Those are people who worked with me in different constellations over the time that I was working on the book. You see the cover is here on the first page. These people have worked with me, and I would always like to acknowledge them. Of course, I have been inspired by many other people along the way, and I would like to mention today Bruno Latour, who died yesterday, who was one of my teachers. So these are the people who come after me. He was younger than me, and he was one who came before me. Okay. So, as the introduction already said, this work had the idea of rethinking the human. And one of the ways I was concerned with the human in this particular book is not simply to make another theory, quote unquote, about the human. There is no such thing as the human. That's a universalist fantasy. There are lots of humans. But there is an image of what humans are that is embedded in the language that we use, in the metaphors we have, in the terms, and also in what one might call exemplary situations. And exemplary situations, that is a term from another of my former teachers, Lauren Nauta. These are situations that exemplify what a theory tries to articulate. And so oftentimes a theory fits in exemplary situations, but then is transported to other situations where it no longer fits. Now, what I've been doing is reread old text by wondering what are the exemplary situations in those texts, what are they about? While they seem to be abstract oftentimes, or they seem to be general. And what happens if instead of what they are about, we insert eating, situations of eating? Now this still sounds really abstract, so I hope when I tell my story you gradually get the point. Where the hell is this computer? Yes. So the format that I try to follow in this book is that of thinking away from something. So it's not criticism. I mean, one of the classic formats, especially of philosophy, is the critique. You are wrong. No, I'm right. And what I have tried to do, as many others are trying, is to leave that format, but to situate. So to think, the people I read, why in the specific circumstances that they wrote, did they write in that way? And that doesn't mean what caused their thinking, but what did they try to respond to? What did they grapple with? So that is a way of situating what you read, not thinking, is it right or wrong, but where is it? And that's literally situating in response to what. Now, if you look in rather broad strokes, I have been given 45 minutes to 60 minutes. If you look at a lot of the work in Western philosophy, let's situate that to begin with, although that is a very weird way of situating, but okay, let's go with that convention for the time being. If you look at a lot of that 20th century work about the human, it had very specific 20th century concerns. One of them was to move beyond the mind-body dualism. Another was to move beyond what you could call instrumentalization, objectification of people. So this was the emergence of industry, and I have not for nothing here an image of the fear that humans were turned into instruments by all these technological revolutions, and that was one of the things that philosophical anthropology, so thinking about the human, was trying to move away from. And other really big inspiration, especially after the Second World War, was to think away from war and totalitarianism, and very much in a lot of the literature on the human of the 50s and 60s that is one of the backdrops. I'll make that more concrete. I'll give you 3 examples of books that are important in thinking about the human in the 20th century. One is Merleau-Ponty, that's the earliest one, and I take here the phenomenology of perception. That was a breakthrough, la phénoménologie de la perception. That was a breakthrough because what he did was trying to bring thinking down to earth, you could say. So in contrast to a lot of philosophy before him, he tried to say, no, thinking is part of the human body. It's something people do with and as a body. And it happens thanks to perceiving. And he related that kind of thinking to moving as an integrated whole through one's surroundings. And in his book, I had a copy that I could look for the word eating, and once or twice the word eating is there. And of course, Merleau-Ponty knew that you have to eat in order to survive, but these were then mere preconditions. Eating and breathing are, in a book like that, as mere preconditions. So thinking was brought into the body, but it was a moving body and a perceptive body, not an eating body. Another relevant book what helps me to illustrate what the human was made in the 20th century is the book of Hans Jonas, The Phenomenon of Life, and that was a reflection on biology. And what is original in Hans Jonas is that he starts with eating, and he starts with eating of plants, and he calls that an act. The metabolizing of plants, he draws it out of the passivity, and he calls it an act. But animals are higher in his idea of biology, because they do not only eat, on the place where they are, they move to eat, and they deplete the food on the spot where they are, And what was more relevant to Jonas, they have empathy. Humans are on the apex of biology and of life because they have moral reasoning and they have what he really underlines, desperation. Now, the third book I mention here is, again, I mean, of course, listen, if you want to have a lecture on these books, somebody could talk a few hours on each of these books. Right? So I'm being very sketchy here. So then there's Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition. Now, there you have really the human in the title, The Human Condition. Now, what she does is split the human condition into 3 layers. Labor, that is cyclical care. It's what in the Greek situation, she takes her references from Aristotle, is done by women and what in the Greek society were called slaves. And that's really uninteresting. Because it's repetitive and cyclical and boring. And then you had work that was making durable goods. That's what craftsmen did. That was somehow interesting to do. But what she thought was really worthwhile and what was marking something that humans could do was political deliberation. Now, in the Greek society, that was the activity of free man. And in a way, what Arendt was trying to achieve is that we could all be free man, so to speak. Also, people classified as women or as slaves formerly, but their tasks were demeaning tasks. So she had the free man as an ideal. Now, if you have paid attention, you will no doubt see, no, I'm joking, that these 3 books make the same hierarchy in slightly different terms. So below in the pyramid is something basic, it's necessary, it's metabolizing or what plants do, and it's labor. So these are the preconditions. Then you have the moving in Merleau-Ponty, the animal of Jonas, and the work in Arendt. That's sort of okay. And then you have what really distinguished of the human. It's that the human can think and can engage in what Arendt called action, in political deliberation and creative political inventions of how to organize life. Now, this all made eminent sense in some way in the 20th century in relation to the problems of the time, and to say, in a response to, let's say, Auschwitz, to say the human is not a beast, or the human should not be handled as a beast. However, we're in the 21st century, and if we take one of the eminent, all these problems of the 20th century are not over. There's wars going on all over the place. But we've got a new one as one of our central concerns, which is ecological concerns. Now, if you do not start with alienation and war, but you start with ecological concerns, then eating is no longer a mere precondition of life. It is one of the precious tasks that we have. It's really difficult to do. It's not just given before we start to think. It's something that really has to be organized in a quite complex way. Neither is it natural as it appears in Jonas. It's not a natural thing to do, because that's why I have the picture here with all the technology that's involved in it. The way we eat it's full of questions of, let's say, how to cultivate. And this is both how to cultivate which kind of crops and how to grow them where, but it's also how to pack them, and etc. and so on. You know these stories. And it's certainly not cyclical, this eating, because as we fear and as we know, eating is not simply going on cyclical, because the current way of global food production is about depletion of the earth, it's not cyclical. So the human, that made sense in the 20th century, doesn't make sense in the context of the ecological concerns of the 21st. Now, after having realized that, I started to think, okay, I can say that, that's the critical bit, now for something different. So I wondered, if this human of the 20th century doesn't work in an ecological setting, how can we try to start thinking differently? And what I did is look for exemplary situations of eating, and not of the human, as I already indicated there. I don't think there is such a thing, but of specific human beings, thus in very concrete, banal situations. And the various people in my team studied eating in all kind of complicated settings very differently. I mean, there was one who studied eating of worms, and earthworms, very interesting creatures. Somebody else studied problems with eating in Guatemala, and later she studied attempts to grow insects in such a way that humans might eat them, etc. and so on. So they did all kinds of interesting eating. I did very banal eating. And I'll give you some examples of where that led to. Now, I'll dwell a bit on what in the book is chapter 2, which is the chapter on being. So with my banal fieldwork, I try to do this grandiose thing of rethinking being. This 20th century human body, and here especially Merleau-Ponty is important, was an integrated whole. That was a new thing to think in the 20th century, that this was an integrated whole that moved through surroundings. And the theories were very much inspired by soldiers who in the First World War had gotten wounds when they would have their heads above the trenches. They would get head wounds. Now, if you have a nasty head wound, you're no longer an integrated whole. And there were all kinds of rehabilitation things that started. So that very much inspired, via a neurologist who wrote about that, Merleau-Ponty, in his thinking of when the body is not a whole, thinking doesn't happen, moving doesn't happen. And later theories also about how this body was relating through perception to surroundings. But to go very short, the shortest summary of the chapter is to say, if in walking a body walks through the world, in eating the world moves through the body. So that's the chapter. I'll say a bit more about it. So what we have here is not the body, but different versions of the body, different ways of conceptualizing and of practicing the body. This, let's say quickly, the Merleau-Ponty body is what you would call in medical terms neuromuscular. As I indicated already, there is a brain, there is perceptive organs, and there is muscles to move. And they are an integrated whole surrounded by the skin. Now, if you look at a metabolic body, then you have the issue that this body is differentiated. It has inside and outside, and it's not easy to cross from the outside to the inside. I did some field work with a speech therapist who was teaching people who had a brain damage to swallow again. And then that's always a way to see how difficult something is, to see it in a place where people have to learn it. So swallowing is really difficult. And but it also means that there is no given inside and outside. Now the water is outside me, and now it's inside. Or is it? That's exactly the question. It's really interesting if you start to look at bodily boundaries. We could say that if I just swallowed the water, it's inside me, because it has passed my throat. And indeed, for a speech therapist and a patient working with the speech therapist, that's the moment they're happy. Yes, food is inside. But if you have food that doesn't cross your bowel linings, then there is something inside you, but it's not inside you. It's in your bowels, but not in your blood. So that's the second border to cross. So when is the food inside you, if you have swallowed it, or if it's absorbed into your bloodstream? And then earlier I had done field work with patients with diabetes, or with practices where patients were helped with living with their diabetes. And in a disease like that, the problem is that even if you have sugar in your blood, it's not necessarily in your cells. So then suddenly the border between the outside and the inside of the body is on the edge, on the cell wall of every cell. So instead of having this nice integrated whole, we suddenly have a body with all kinds of different boundaries. So eating makes, even thinking through eating, makes you see a very different kind of body. And these boundaries also go the other way around. When does food leave me again? Or leave you? You can say it leaves a body in the kidneys when the excess or when toxins are filtered out in the kidney system, or it leaves the body in the toilet. But there's a complication there. If you are treated in the medical system and they want, for several diagnoses, they may want to see your urine. So you put your urine or your features in a little bottle and your name is on it. Hey, apparently it's still you. But if it enters in the wastewater treatment system, you're not going to say, oh, that's my bit there. So actually it's one of the big problems of pollution that we all deny it's still ours when it's in the wastewater treatment system. So what happens with metabolic transformations along the way is not just that an inside and an outside are crossed, but also that all kind of things transform. What was food becomes me, what was me becomes something in the wastewater treatment system, and, well, in a nice church it's good to speak about transubstantiation, which means something slightly different in the Christian tradition, but it is literally what happens. One substance becomes another. There's folding in and spreading out. And what folds in is not simply surroundings. If you have this image of the human walking through their surroundings, you can see here's the human, there's the surroundings. That was a very strong image of what a human was in relation to the surroundings. It used to be called his in the 20th century. But when you think through eating, the whole meaning of surroundings changes. Because if you had coffee this morning, or tea for that matter, what folded into you is not your surroundings, it's bits and pieces from either Kenya, Nicaragua, Vietnam, you don't even know maybe, and they got folded into your body or my body. An apple may come in this time of the year. An apple in the Netherlands may come actually from the Netherlands. If you buy an apple in March, it can come from New Zealand. So what happens with the way we organize eating? So this is not natural eating. Our surroundings have become spread out and we get very complicated folds. So all this gives, I think, a new insight in how we may think being. It becomes not an integrated whole, but something that is spatially complex, with faraway outsides folding in, with transformations, with insides excreted and travel out again. So, because just like the coffee folds in from we don't know where, what we excrete also folds out to we don't know where. In the wastewater treatment plant, some of the stuff is gathered and put into the undergrowth of roads. Other things are burned and become energy. Where do I go? So, if you want to fascinate you, want more the nitty-gritty details of that, read the book. The next chapter in the book is about knowing. I'm going to be very short on knowing because I can't do all the chapters this long. But the basic 101 of the knowing chapter is that instead of a subject knowing the world from a distance, which is one of the dominant images, traditional images of knowing, that it would happen from a distance, as if that was knowing was a visual thing. In eating, what you know transforms you. So the subject is always transformed by what they eat. And the object is always also transformed. First there was an apple, then I ate it. Part of it is me, but it's certainly no longer apple. The other interesting thing about knowing in relation to eating is that facting and valuing cannot be separated easily. I mean, some people can train that. I taste ginger, but I'm not going to say whether I like it or not. In taste laboratories, they train people to do facts and not values. But in almost any other circumstances, you say, ooh, that's good, is it ginger? So they go together, or it's bad because it's ginger, it doesn't matter. But the knowing and the valuing are really far more difficult to distinguish in eating practices than it tends to be imagined in the traditional image of the neuromuscular human. Doing is also very different. My doing gets spread out. I mean, the there's all kind of fascinating, by the way, really interesting post-phenomenology studies on how thinking is no longer in the body but is spread out over all kind of practices and materials. But this is the same for digestion, because if the food is cooked, part of the digestion is done in the kitchen. And it's also done in all kind of ways that, let's say, the crop selection that over the centuries farmers have been doing is to a large extent to select crops that are easier to digest. So the doing of my body is spread out in all kind of ways. What is also really crucial in the doing, I think, is how it's torn between different goods. One of the first weeks that I started on this project, so this is a while ago, on the Dutch newspaper that I would read, there were 2 stories about eating fish. And the one story said, eating fish is good for your health. The other story said, fishing is depleting the oceans. And the newspaper had put them both on the front page and not solved that conundrum. And since then, I mean, this is more than 10 years ago, this is pushed into our faces more and more, and it's one of these unentangleable contradictions between what is good to eat and not. And it's really, in that sense, a tragic and a true case of how the different goods clash. And both are true. It's not that one is true and the other is false, so to speak. Let's presume that. The point is not that either of these outcomes is wrong in the sense of false and not true. Both kinds of research can have been done perfectly well, but they still have totally clashing outcomes. So what I suggest in the doing chapter is that instead of thinking that you can solve these problems, the only thing is to tinker with them and to keep trying. That's what we do, huh? Good, I'll tell a bit more. Let me see. Oh, yeah, I can tell a bit more. We're not that far in time yet. About the next chapter, which is a chapter about relating. And here I go mainly into the relating of humans to other animals. And there's been quite some work recently about the relating of humans to other animals. And predominantly, this is not completely so because there's not in food studies, but elsewhere, the fascination is with kinship relations, with genetic relations, with ancestral connections. And this goes back to the Darwinian idea of the 19th century that humans are in a way part of the kinship system with animals. And there were all kinds of scandals in the 19th century that indeed literally said, oh, but now he says that monkeys are our cousins. So there were even kinship terms used for that. Now there are all kinds of fascinating analysis how Darwin actually imported English ideas of the English gentry about what kinship was in his biology. So the kinship ideas were imported into the biology. But what is interesting for now is that that whole idea of kinship very much still dominates thinking about human-animal relations, while if in kinship terms the monkey is indeed our cousin, as soon as we think through eating, we have very different connections. In terms of thinking, in terms of kinship, the monkey is close to me, while in terms of eating the apple, there is the apple again, is much closer to me. I eat apples. I happen to really not eat monkeys. And that means that you start to, through eating, you start to ask questions about very different types of relating. Because there has been great work, I mean, I'm again not critiquing this work, it's really inspiring, about how we may relate to other animals. As Kim, for instance, the work of Don Harrowby on companion species. Now, what is a companion species? Companion is literally those you eat with, compane. And she talks about how with her dog she shares food and play. But if with a companion you sit around the table, you have a very different relation to that which is on the table, the species that you eat. And then, in as far as people talk about, there's written about that, you get this first idea that the species who are eaten by humans thereby are vanished, they disappear. But if you look at it a bit more closely, this is a relationship where both make each other be. It's only because humans love apples that there are lots of apple trees. Apple trees have done much better than many other trees. And this goes also for other species that humans eat, like, or drink milk of. There's lots of cows, especially Holsteins, Frisian Holstein, because they give a lot of milk. There would never have been so many Frisian Holstein without my liking milk. And I say my to really situate it and to also make myself complicit in this. This is also not the type of thinking you can think as an outsider. Huh? In the eating also gives each body a sort of metabolic relation, and then you can drink either cow milk or you can drink oat milk, but it's a slightly different embodiment, but you cannot not drink. Well, you can, but then you die. Huh? So there is this relation to those, oops, now I go the wrong way. Here. So there's the relation to the species we eat that are proximate, like the apple, but then there's also relating to all kinds of others who do not eat what I eat. And I have, in a way, they're the competitors. I have a story about a friend of mine who has a vegetable garden, and we meticulously build, she has this stuff around the garden with all kind of nets so that the rabbits and the hares cannot eat the food. So then literally in the garden you see the competition between the human who wants the carrots and the rabbits who also want the carrots. But of course, in a strange way, there would not be carrots there without the humans. This was actually in a polder. There would not even be land there without the humans. So who you are in competition with is not always easy to see. But maybe you're in competition with the fish who would have been there if the land hadn't been there, etc., and so on. So as we know, there is also this fierce competition via soy given to pigs, etc., with large terrains in the Amazon. So who do I compete with? Maybe with bromelia, which one of the plants would otherwise grow there. And now this is one of the most clear cases where winning is self-defeating, because you can win from the hare, but if you win from all the competitors, there's no longer any food left. So what we have then as the lesson about relating is that classic questions about relating also to animals were about calling upon us to recognize the similarities. I am like the dog is like me. It's also not for nothing that these days it's no longer humans and animals, but humans and other animals, or even human and non-human animals, to stress the similarities. But as soon as you think relating not through kinship and similarities, but through eating, the problem becomes not recognizing that we are different, same, but recognizing that we're different, that we have different positions. And the question becomes how to handle the differences rather than how to recognize the similarities. And also how to handle the dependence. Because, let's say, I depend on the apple tree. The apple tree depends on me. But what kind of dependence is that? And how to handle the asymmetries in that type of dependence. Good. Now, the kind of philosophy that I'm trying to do here, with shifting these sort of big terms like being, knowing, doing, and relating, is one where what philosophy offers is not sort of conclusive theories about how things are, but a language in which we can talk all kind of other talk. So it's also a language that travels through the social sciences or through the humanities and in other intellectual realms, or as soon as language is spoken. So this is sort of an infra rather than a meta philosophy. And there is a lot to say about eating for its own sake. What I have done here now is call upon these stories of eating to say something with eating, and to shift the terms that we think with by taking these fairly banal eating stories that won't surprise you if you read the newspaper, or whatever other source of information you have, to take them and think, what follows from that? What follows from that if we take that really serious? And to shift the terms in such a way that they become terms that fit the present and concerns with early survival. So this is a book that doesn't have a firm statement or good conclusions, but it's an attempt to inspire. So what I've been trying to do today is this book also doing is really push and pull a bit in classic ways of thinking. And you could, if you have the energy to read it, you can also think, oh, I like chapter 3, but not 4, or the other way around, or this page is interesting, I can use that for my thesis, or etc., and so on. So it's one to savor and to eat from. Thank you.
Thank you, Annemarie Mol, for this inspiring lecture. It made me think out of the box, almost literally. Thank you. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand and I come.
You can also first say, what did you mean there with that?
Any explanations? Yeah.
Well, in the beginning you said something about you had that hierarchy.
Pardon, I don't hear you very well.
You had that hierarchy
Yes.
from Merleau-Ponty, Jonas and Arendt. And then you said humans are connected to action, animals are connected to work, and plants to labor.
That is not what I say, that is how I read the text. So in those hierarchies, maybe I didn't stress that good enough, in those hierarchies eating is low. So by thinking with eating rather than, so here eating is low in the hierarchy. Thinking is what really humans are about. Eating is merely eating in all these 20th century ways of talking about the human. It's not interesting. It's not something you have to contemplate. You have to do it and then you can go on to do what's really important. And that's one of the reasons that I thought, well, wait a minute. We can no longer afford that way of thinking about eating. It's not what you can just have as something not really important, because all the other things, it's not just that all the other things depend on it. I mean, they would recognize that if you don't eat, you die, and so that thinking doesn't happen without eating, but it still goes without saying. I mean, you can, okay, we need that, and then we can go on. What I said, we can no longer be so quick about eating, and to put it low in the hierarchy, we have to swap the hierarchy. And I'm not saying eating is important and thinking isn't. It's a bit self-defeating if you write books. But it's also not the case that thinking is more important than eating. Without food, I could never have write a book. I couldn't stand here and talk if I hadn't eaten for a few days. So the whole thing, the attempt, one of the attempts of this book is to interfere with that hierarchy. So this is not what I say, this is a summary of, well, a very sketchy summary. There's lots of other things in these books, but this is a summary of what concerns me or disconcerts me in those books.
Okay, this is 20th century human philosophy. It's not your thinking, but I just want to ask my question. I not already asked my question.
Okay.
What do you mean with the fact that animals are related to work and plants to labor? I don't have the impressions that plants think about themselves that they are laboring, and I don't think animals are thinking they are working. For instance, if people are going for food, yes, with a gun or something, they mostly do it as pleasure, not as a work. So they think, oh, this is a pleasure.
It's very interesting that, sorry about that. What you now try to do is to dream up how you think things are. And that was not what I was doing here. I was showing that Merleau-Ponty has a hierarchy, Jonas has a hierarchy, and Arendt has a hierarchy, and they each time have 3 layers, and each time eating is low and thinking is high. So the analogy that I point out here is not that animals are working, but that animals have the same position in the hierarchy of Jonas as work has in the hierarchy made by Hannah Arendt, and as moving has in the hierarchy made. So it's not that animals work, let alone that they think they work, but it's that the theoretical repertoire that is dreamt up in these books has an analogous structure. So this is it. Sorry that I didn't make that clear in the first, but it's like 5 steps abstract from that. I'm not saying animals work. I'm saying something about a specific theoretical tradition here.
Oh, okay, when I try to relate it to levels, and not of your thinking, but the thinking of other philosophers, okay. But what the hell is the difference between work and labor? Why is
in Hannah
work,
Arendt?
may I
Yeah.
ask my question first? Yes. Why is work of the second hierarchy and labor of the third hierarchy? Can you explain me that?
That is a very good question. I don't agree with that hierarchy, but that's a hierarchy that Hannah Arendt makes, where she defines the word labor as cyclical work that comes back time and again, and she defines the work, the term work, as crafting durable goods. So this is not something about the English language, but this is a way of Arendt to make a difference between things you have to do again and again, like cooking, washing, growing food, and things that you can do in her time, once in a lifetime, like making a table or making a chair. And she wanted to differentiate between those two activities, and she picked these 2 English terms for that.
Yes, I see. And over there. One moment.
No, it was sorry. It was just relating back to the term of labor. Does labor just mean care work in this context, or what they'd call care work now?
Wait a minute, sorry, I went. Well, you could call it care work, yeah,
Okay.
but then it's, yeah, you could call it care work. But of course, in Aristotle, where she comes from, it wouldn't be called that way, but that's fine. That's a way of understanding it that might be helpful, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I see. I come to you.
In the beginning, hi. In the beginning, you mentioned how you were drawn to banal examples, everyday examples, and your colleagues were interested in some more, some out of the ordinary examples.
This was self-irony, but go on, yeah.
I am still wondering what attracts you about, because there are still very banal examples in the book, and what attracts you about everyday examples, and maybe why your colleagues are trying to get the other ones, and why would you pick certain examples?
Well, actually, of course, I discussed with my colleagues what examples we would take and what's the interest of it. But apart from the great, for instance, the insect eating, we had done with a few people a field work on the insect eating, and then one of us went on to study it because we thought it was really. She wrote actually a really good article about this called "The World in a Box." About how these researchers in Wageningen think that if they grow insects, they can feed the world, and how that doesn't quite work. But because the concept insect is really not the same in different languages, and people who eat insects tend to eat really nice, crusty crickets and not mealworms, which is what the Wageningen insect researchers were part of what they were doing anyway. But let me answer the question why I study banal examples. And this has partly to do with this kind of hierarchizing. Banal examples tend to be understudied and underestimated. And by opening them up, there's a lot to learn, partly because they're understudied. And as simple as that, if they're hardly studied because they are taken for granted, it's easier to say something new about them. So understudied examples. But also, I think they tend to be really relevant because, how to say that? Ordinary life is a lot of what life is about. And life is not just about grandiose things. So in that sense, it's almost, if I go simple, it's almost to prove Hannah Arendt wrong on this. No, action is not the most interesting thing. The work of women and slaves is where it really happens. Let me show you. And, well, it tends to work well to study banal things for me, for these kind of things.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, idealistically, what would you expect from our modern Western society?
Can you do that quietly? Because
Yes. So idealistically, what would you expect from our modern Western society and our relationship with food?
What I respect from what?
What would you expect for
For modern society
from
and
our
its
modern
relationship?
society?
Yes. Well, I don't think how to say that. I don't think society relates to food, huh? And you can have all kind of images and imaginations of how in modernity relations to food have been orchestrated and organized. And one of the things that is relevant here is that, for a start, it has nothing to do with nature, quote unquote. But actually, how to say that? As soon as you have agriculture, you have culture in a relation to food, and we also still have agriculture. So I think one of the things in let's say present-day societies everywhere to different degrees is complex relations to food, because they're different from different foods, they're different for different modes of eating, they're different for different types of industrialization. So it's almost impossible to think one thing about them, but I'm also not going to say, oh, it's all bad, because it's in a way also an absolutely miraculous achievement. If you compare with a century ago, the people who are grandfathers there, how much larger percentage of people had hunger and had a lot of hunger. So on the one hand, it's miraculous that society has been orchestrated in such a way that in very many places so many people can eat enough food, while at the same time it's in an unsustainable way. So I think it's a really difficult conundrum, because it's also too simple to say technology is bad, because that's why we can eat. And luckily, well, I'm in that sense not in a good place to solve that. All kind of people who study food production really also from the inside out and together with different groups of people have a lot more interesting things to say about that. And I've read them, but I don't do that kind of study. I'm really a philosopher in that sense, or an anthropologist and a philosopher. But I think one thing is that I would never want to give an easy answer to that kind of question. My first question is, yes, I think about it, if you see what I mean. And it deserves a lot of thought and of different types of research. Yeah?
First of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was really lovely to listen to. And I was thinking about this, back to this banal examples of eating in daily life. And then I was thinking about these other examples that your colleagues had used, let's say for insects. What would happen if you think about some of the examples you used then if I was thinking if you go to a really nice restaurant or a place where it kind of foregrounds those the different sensations of eating, or a place that foregrounds that it's local food. So you do think about those things. Does that play with some of these different conceptualizations of eating in a different way, perhaps, than if it was just my breakfast cereal that I don't think of where it was produced? And does that add a layer in some way of how we can think about?
Well, I mean, this almost folds back into the question we just had. This would be an interesting place to analyze ways in which modern societies do eating, because they do them in different ways. Let's say a high-end restaurant orchestrates aesthetics as the value of, or as what is relevant about eating, while if you have something where to go to and you quickly eat a bit of bread or porridge in the morning, you do eating as needing sustenance to go through your day. So that's already, eating can be done in an aesthetic way or practiced in a nutrition way. One is foregrounded and the other is backgrounded. Now, those things tend with eating not to be totally separate. If you have a quick breakfast every morning, you tend to do something you sort of like. So there is another type of aesthetics at work. I mean, we also know eating in a posh restaurant every night downgrades the aesthetics, etc. and so on. So you open up a research field here of how eating may be done in different ways. And also, in what I haven't done now in the talk is in the book, I have all kind of stories of books I've read of others who show that eating is done and is something very differently in different ways globally. One of my favorite is the first one. It's a short summary of one of, I think, an absolutely smashing book by Bashkov about a group in Papua New Guinea where they define white men, written as one word, as people who eat tinned fish and rice, light food that you can travel with, rather than real people of the Orokaiva, the tribe that they are, who eat taro and pigs, which are heavy, because they're heavy with obligations. So in a lot, I mean, this comes out of a lot of Papua New Guinea anthropology in different ways. It's not my field, but of course I've read it, which is that then eating is not about the relation of the person to the food, but of the person to other people. So what eating is so different in different sites and situations. Yep, and that's why one of the reasons why this book has taken me a lot of time, because I thought first, oh, I'm going to change philosophy with eating, nice. And then we started to study eating. It's so many things. Yeah, that was also an answer to why the banal examples are at least somewhat controllable to work with, because if I would have related to all these eatings, the book could totally have been all over the place.
Yeah, thank you for your wonderful talk. I had a question about how thinking with eating travels to other banal sensory experiences or practices, like you mentioned breathing already, or smelling, and yeah, your thoughts on that.
Well, my first thought is I hope somebody's going to do that properly, because that breathing is a lot to do. I know of some people who are starting to study breathing. It's an obvious next thing to do, because there are similarities and huge differences. Because in a way, while with eating, let's say I mentioned the coffee from, let's say, Kenya that I may have been drinking this morning. In breathing, I breathe the air here. But then you get the whole question, how does the air travel and not travel, etc. and so on. And with breathing, we also have, well, don't need to tell anybody since COVID, we have other human relations through breathing, because you breathe all kind of virus and other pollutions, etc. and so on. So I have no idea where that would end up. I can babble a bit, but it's really something that needs to be done. And if you think about other sensory experiences, what is, of course, immediately happening in eating, one of the things we did in another text that was not now necessarily in the book, is to shift what sensory experiences are. Because this other Aristotelian story that keeps circling, that humans have 5 senses, I think it's really outdated, as you would know. And for instance, the restaurants really play on, if they play on aesthetics, on mouth feel and nose feel, and very little on belly feel. While you could also say the belly tastes food. And to the belly, as also everybody knows, if you eat an apple, your belly tastes something different than if you eat porridge. And that is a way of sensing food that also there's still a lot of more fun things to do there. So go ahead, send me that article. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you, Annemarie, for a beautiful book and talk. So this morning I was worried about formulating a good, smart question. I was really worried about that. And so instead, I brought you some figs from my garden. I will give them to you later. Which is not yet the question, right? However, maybe there is a question in there. Maybe this is my question. How do your examples, how does food itself even, or eating itself, how does that end up becoming theory? How is that not really a thinking exercise? How did you process that kind of food that was actually in your hands, in your fingers, in your mouth? Yeah, what kind of ways did it find to your writing, for instance?
Well, that's a good new materialist question, and in a way, I don't know. If I say I can only write because I eat an apple, that in a way builds on very traditional medical ideas or biological ideas of the body being fat and my brain eating sugar. I could do that. But yeah, is that the way to go? Should we go? I mean, that seems to give the apple activity, but it does it via the story of a particular type of biology. I can also, one of the things that would be interesting is to also dream up other type of relations for that. And I'm sometimes a bit worried that if we want to go to the real activity of the stuff, that we delude ourselves, because the question is always which activity in which version. We actually, with a few people of this same wonderful team, we wrote an article about omega-3. I don't know if you see that. But there was a philosopher who wanted to point out that things are active, because that was the newest theory on the block. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't be ironical. But anyway, she had as an example that if you eat omega-3 fatty acids, your mood improves. And we thought, yeah, fine. And we went to look for the original articles on which that was based, and they turned out to be prison research, where underfed and malnourished prisoners were improving if they had vitamins and omega-3. So that was our first line of saying, wait a minute, that research is actually not omega-3 improves the mood of humans, but in this particular situation, that turned out to be good. And our second question was, where the hell does the omega-3 come from? And this was from fish. One of my colleagues traced the omega-3 that comes to Sweden and turned all out to be from fish fished in West Africa. So local people had less protein so that the Swedes could improve their moods, which probably wasn't true anyway. So my reaction in relation to truth stories or action stories is to say on which terms, where, and why is it relevant? How to say that? In that sense, a book like this is it's not something food does. It couldn't be done without eating, but it is, how to say that? It's the work of a collective brain. It's not for nothing that I have the heads of these people here, huh? And not their bellies. Yeah.
You have a small question, yes?
And there's somebody else there too. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, it's really small.
It's fine.
I'm very, very curious about philosophy being a meta-language or being a language. And perhaps we can talk later about it. But I was curious to hear from you if you still consider philosophy being a discipline. Or what is philosophy if it's not a discipline? And then if we look at other disciplines and philosophy, should we still look at boundaries, or how do you consider this? How do you look at it?
Small question.
Small question. How to say that? It depends on what your concern is with a discipline. If you have an institutional definition of discipline, yes. I mean, there are departments of philosophy, there are journals of philosophy, so yeah. But then if you, how to say it, like all kind of disciplines, if you zoom in closer and you wonder, is that philosophy, is that philosophy? Yeah. it's his own empirical question as far as I'm concerned. I don't have a normative answer. But as a philosopher, you would appreciate that I don't have a normative answer. But how to say? The second thing is the way I think what is relevant, why I relate to all these words, is not to philosophy as a meta, but as I said, as an infra reality. So I think that also people who are not philosophers use all kind of words that come out of particular philosophical traditions, and then they may get stuck in philosophical traditions they don't even know exist, so because they're not taught that. So one of the things is to dig them out and to shake them up. I like that. It's fun, but it's also not just fun. Of course, it's also in my imagination, a way of contributing to shifting these things, and in a way very much a Foucauldian idea of adapting the terms to the times.
Thank you very much for this very, very interesting topic about eating. And most of the time people think about eating as just in your hierarchy, it's in the bottom, it's just to feed our body and so we can do better things. And so after listening your talk, I feel should be more mindful about eating, and it's not just to, fill up our body, also give us a pleasant feeling. We should be more appreciate, like you mentioned about the apples is made in Netherlands now, and maybe in the springtime it comes from New Zealand. It makes me think about the hand that handle this apple, the person who planted it, pick it up. And I find that's really give, a more higher thinking, and also how people share the food together, like I'm originally from China, so people eating is more as a social event in many places in the world. That is kind of, eating is an important way to connect people. And I feel sometimes now, so many meal here was eaten while reading iPad and working in front of the computer. Maybe, that's kind of, maybe we should work on to really appreciate food. If you appreciate food, maybe you should not waste food and the plate, which is so bad for the earth.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think there are two relevant things there. One is indeed food, as soon as food is not something natural but cultivated, there's lots and lots of people involved. So the dependency that I talked about is a dependency to other creatures, but also to lots of other people who do the digesting for me, who do the growing and the handling, and there's lots of labor involved. The second thing that I think is interesting in what you say, to bring up, to relate that to the question of the lady in front of you about eating in modern societies, and I hadn't thought about that. It eludes me now. Which is that that can be orchestrated also in very different ways as an event. And one of the things that you see in nutrition science is that eating gets metricized, and in terms of calories or in terms of different types, and that would be the physics way of conceptualizing eating, or in terms of nutrients in the chemical language, rather than taking through pleasure. I wrote with Elze, who is there on top of my list, an article about which we called "Enjoy Your Food," that you might like, because what we found is that a lot of especially dietitian traditions give people guidance about food through counting rather than through enjoying. And we had the idea that by enjoying, well, it's not just our idea, we found other practitioners who worked to increase joy for food. It gave people a very different relation to it. So yes, I agree with you there.
Thank you very much. So this is the first time for me personally that I encountered somebody like you talking like this about food, and the only place other than this that I encountered like theory or thought about food in this direction was religion. So was this incorporated into your basic, like how to reach what you read or what you reach basically?
Thank you. You're so right. Religious traditions tend to be more attentive to eating. Partly, I think also, I mean, this goes outside of my research, but partly because they have been supporting also people in grappling with hunger over the centuries. The awareness of hunger is more acute in most religions than in science, partly through the way it relates to other practices. But I haven't studied religion in this particular book. I mean, I was asking myself already, but there are other people who do that. There are great studies about food and religion. And of course, this is also different in different religions, because the most interesting one in a way is the Jain religion in India, where a really good Jain doesn't eat. So you can't do that very long. But then the best thing of being, so that's also in quite a lot of religions, there are all kind of ways of what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, and why and when, and etc. and so on. Enormous field. If you Google it, you find lots. Yeah, but thank you also for mentioning that you've rarely heard an intellectual talk about eating. That a scholar talking about eating, that falls back to what I've been saying. It's a neglected topic. Now there is a field called food studies, and there are lots of people in the field called food studies who do smashing research on eating in particular sites and situations, on food actually. I mean, this is, by the way, a subtle difference. When you study food, it's the apple. When you study eating, then it's, then it's this. This is not studying the apple, but studying eating. That's really something different. I see a question back there. Oh, there's one there too.
Yeah, I will come to you. Oh, there.
Many thanks, Annemarie, for the beautiful book and also for this talk. I want to go back to the very beginning of your own talk, where you said, when I read text, when I read books, I want to position them. So when they were written and with whom they were actually in conversation. So now I think about your book, and it seems to me that you are both in conversation with the past, with the 20th century philosophers, but also with today, with the ecological problems. Are there other conversation partners you had in mind with this project?
Whoa, yeah, you all here. So indeed, conversation partners were also people who I thought might, for their own reasons, find this interesting, because that's the people I wrote the book for. So that's indeed preempting a conversation. So indeed, if I'm in conversation, let's say with Hannah Arendt, it's because that I'm already thinking for 40 years, it doesn't, is it 40? Yes. It doesn't work, what's wrong with this? And that had to do with the hierarchy. So these are long-term conversations with, and as you said, the eating is there. But I have tried to write the book also for people who I thought might find it interesting. And whether that's successful or not, maybe I reached you. It's enough. Yeah. So, but that's of course a very difficult conversation in a way. Although that was also why it was good to work around others and never work alone. It's interesting to have conversations going to see what emerges from one's ideas. But maybe if you read it, you recognize something, you think, ooh, secretly this is what she's in conversation. May well be, one never knows. I mean, I don't think as an author you can be transparent about what you're doing. You're very far away.
Yeah. First, thank you so much for the talk, and I find it really inspiring. And my question relates more to the bigger concept, so not eating itself, but language. Would you say that language is to humanity what, like, to the consciousness or to our way of understanding the world, what math is for, like, to understanding science. Like, what is your whole opinion on language itself? Like, where does it get us? And yeah, what does it relate to consciousness itself, if you can give an answer?
Okay, thanks for that question. I don't think about language or the human, but about languages and humans. So that is my first reflect. So I totally see where your question comes from. It is a valid question, of course. But my ethnographic reflex, is to always say, yeah, where is language? I don't see language. We're speaking English now. We might be speaking Dutch or French or Italian, and it would be different. I mean, this is, and by the way, something I'm also working on, how in different languages things are said and done differently. And the fact that English has become the dominant imperialist language for quite a lot of academia, of course not for all. I mean, there's more Spanish and there's certainly more Chinese. But that English is the language that in a university like Maastricht we work in, or in Amsterdam, same thing, has a lot. I mean, that is more what worries me rather than, and also excites me, because we can talk together and it also worries me. So I think rather than, asking about language of humanity, it gets more interesting if you think, oh, what happens in this language, what happens in that language, how does it help to order things? And then as a part of that, let's say within English, everything I said so far was within English. You have, just like you have New Zealand English and UK English and Delhi English, New Delhi English, you have also all kind of different words that could and couldn't be used and that have different meanings. And that's the sort of things I've been talking about, is tweaking with what it is to know. And in a way you could say this is tweaking with what the practice of knowing is, but also tweaking what we mean when we use the word knowing. So, yeah, my reflex is to go away from the generalized question, because that always is too generalized, and to find a level at which questions make sense. And it's rarely at the biggest level, because those questions have a sort of tradition of universal answers. And that is, how to say that? That's no longer possible in the 21st century, to make a grandiose statement. Yeah? Is that yes, enough of an answer? Or
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Hi. So once again, thank you for your very interesting talk, as well as for the book, which I have to admit I speed read yesterday because I was going to do it before and then I didn't. But so my question is not so much a question as a shameless attempt to get you to expand on one of the things you mentioned in the conclusion.
Fine, go ahead.
So you present your work, or this particular work, as kind of an attempt at shifting, problematizing, opening up certain repertoires that we have to talk about the human, or images that we have about this idea of the human. And so then a concept that wasn't really mentioned so far, but that seems to be looming behind this is this kind of unwieldy idea of politics, which you do address in your conclusion of the book. I remember quite succinctly. And so I'm just kind of wondering whether perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what what could we learn perhaps, about eating in theory, maybe politically, or in practice politically.
Thanks for bringing that up, because that allows me to talk about the conclusion that I skipped. I actually was originally taught to only talk about one chapter, but I cheated already. But if you see the classic understanding of politics, then it's a particular realm. It's what happens in the political realm. And Hannah Arendt has this in her books, but it's traveling all over the place. Now, one of the Foucauldian interventions of Foucault was to say, wait a minute, politics is not just what happens in politics with a capital P, in parliament, But if, let's say, a doctor diagnoses a patient, that is also a political moment because reality gets organized there and then. And that has for a long time inspired me to see other reality ordering moments as politics in their own right. Now, in relation to eating, that means that, again, poor Arendt is here, the shifting point is that you can say there is this specific realm of action and political deliberation. And one of the things my book then says is no, the different ways in which we, let's say, organize what she called labor, the different ways in which we organize eating are also their own politics. And there is something to say for both strategies. Because let's say some colleagues say, well, wait a minute, if you say there's also politics in eating, you forget all the work it takes to politicize eating and to show that there's politics in eating. But as far as I'm concerned, work like what I'm doing and a lot of my friends are doing is part of the work of making that political. But what it then means to be political is also not very clear. And you have in the ecological movement very different strategies going on at the same time. And rather than conventional theorists who would say one of them must be wrong and the other must be good, I'm inclined to see, let's try it all. And one strategy is that of, it's in a way, we mentioned Latour, or I mentioned him in the beginning, his type of strategy is to say, have trees and rivers represented in parliament. And you see that type of thinking, which in a way rhymes with what some indigenous groups have been trying to do with giving rights to mountains or rights to rivers, etc. That is in a way interesting where that leads. At the same time, my strategy is another, and is to say, well, if we organize, to simplify, a world of meat eating or a world of bean eating, we're organizing different realities, so that has its own political dimension, which is not a representation of politics, it's another type of politics. Does that answer your question, Fernand?
Yes. If I can quickly maybe ask then a follow-up question. So I do like this image of indeed the opening up of new possibilities, this idea of, okay, well, let's try different configurations, let's try different ways of ordering things around us. I was wondering if this goes beyond the space of this call, that's also fine. How would you maybe put this idea then in relation with the notion of crisis, which seems to be so omnipresent everywhere, where sometimes we feel like, well, perhaps we want to try things, but also we don't want to get things wrong, which, creates a certain tension there. It's not a very well-defined thought, but...
Yes, sadly, I can't solve that problem for you, but I can give it a try. There are one of the classic modernist ways of tackling problems is to give one answer and order everything along that answer. And while that sounds very attractive in a crisis, then you have one answer, one way in which you can solve them. I think that's a fairly defeated strategy. And it might be a much better idea also at this moment to do what with another colleague, Carolina Dominguez, we have called technological diversity. And we haven't published that one yet, so be careful. No, it's fine. And to try different answers at the same time simultaneously, almost by analogy to what species does. Maybe one of them works. So if you try the big one answer strategy, if it's wrong, you're doomed. Huh? If you try the different types of strategy at the same time, there's much more chance that we can learn from it and we can learn from each other. So in that sense, it would be nice to solve the crisis with a big one, but it's not going to happen. So therefore, if everybody tries what they can, it may yet work together more or less well. Yeah?
One last question for you.
Hi. Sorry. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I just had a question. I was thinking, these concepts that you look at, being and knowing, doing and relating, kind of reminds me of what it is to be human, which I think is also a big part of an identity and having an identity. So I guess my question is, would you argue that our identities are reflected in how we eat, like the choices that we make and what to eat?
Of course, I can understand where you may come from if you say that part of being human is having an identity. I don't think that. But that's something else. But what I'm talking about here is definitions of what it is to be human that were in the literature of the 20th century, that I'm not shifting to answering what it is to be human with one answer, but what it happens with all these ideas if we look to eating of some humans. And now back to identity. If you look at the moment in various societies, not everywhere, all kind of people suddenly appear to be very concerned about their identity. So for me, that's both a historical and a cultural and an ethnographic question. Who's concerned about their identity? Where does that historically come from? Why is that something that's interesting to people? Who is it interesting to and who not? What are the terms in which identity is done? And then you see, if you would do field work at the moment in Maastricht, that there are quite a few people who do their identity through food and through what they eat. And you can see there is also really interesting ethnographic research about people who do their identity through eating if they're migrants. So one of my favorites is an article about Filipino maids who work as a maid in Hong Kong and have then on a Sunday a place where they come together and eat Filipino food. Now their identity is done through eating. And you can also see other places where identity is done through eating when people there's also work on people in Greece who have yearly festivities where they do eating as who they are. But that doesn't mean that people in Papua New Guinea do their identity through food or even have an identity, or that's their concern. So, and you could, if you would do research in Maastricht, you would feed all kind of young women who do veganism as one of the things that they're proud of, and that it has become part of how they demonstrate that they're politically engaged, which is fine. And then they can say, this is part of my identity. So for me, that would be a research question, not something that I think. So this relates to other things. Instead of having these answers, is this generally true or not? It might be really good as a think exercise to think where, when, how. And these general puzzlements that you have, does the human have this identity, to turn them into questions. Not a question, is this true or not, but where, how, when, and really make either historical or ethnographic research about it. That relates to a few of the questions that have been asked. Do you see the shift? I hope it inspires you. Do research on it. It would be fun.
All right. Thank you so much for this very, very interesting lecture, Annemarie. And thank you all for these wonderful questions. And thank you for these great answers. I hope to see you next time at Suriname. Tomorrow we have a film and talk evening about Suriname, the former Dutch colony. And on Thursday we have a lecture about dark matter. But they are both in Dutch, so it's not for all of you. Thank you, and I hope to see you again next.
And thanks for all your questions.